Hi, I'm Jeremy Kirk with Intel 471, and this is Studio 471, our regular video series on cybersecurity and cyber threat intelligence. One of the more insidious practices on the internet is doxing, and this involves publishing personal sensitive information online with the intent of embarrassing or harassing a person. Jacob Larsen is an offensive security researcher at CyberCX, which is a consultancy in Australia. He's done research into doxing and presented it last year at the Black Hat Security Conference, and he's here today to talk about it. Welcome, Jacob.
Thanks, Jeremy.
So you were drawn into this really dark world of doxing unwillingly a few years ago. What happened?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think unlike a lot of typical researchers looking into this space, I have a kind of unique perspective and a personal connection. And that really occurred because 10 years ago, I was actually a victim of doxing myself. I had my personal information released on a doxing website, and it included my name, my email address, mobile number, but quite scaringly as well, my residential address, where I lived with my family, and my personal photos. And I felt my privacy was violated, and I actually had my physical safety threatened as well. And ultimately, I was demanded to pay an extortion. And how this actually began and why I was targeted is because I had an online account with a rare username, like a short character username, and the extorters wanted it either to collect or ultimately to sell because it was worth some money for financial gain. Now, I didn't meet their extortion demands, but I did live in fear of what might happen to me. And so, in a way, I've been able to have a unique perspective and empathize through modern day victims of doxing, understanding the feelings and emotions they go through. And ever since this encounter, I kind of followed the really weird and online subculture, which actually surrounds doxing, but particularly those who participated in it. And that's what's kind of motivated me to do a lot of this research and how I kind of got drawn into this dark world.
And so, yeah, you're an offensive security researcher during the daytime, but you did this research basically in your free time. Just to kind of set a foundation for the chat, what are some of the motivations for doxing? You mentioned one of them was a rare username that your assailants wanted, and who else gets targeted?
Yeah, so ultimately, the motivations and the objectives of doxing is to really, and the intent is to forcibly expose someone's online identity. So linking someone's online username with their real identity. And when we all go on the internet, we have a sense of anonymity, which has been really great for us to be, for the average person to be um, obscured from being creative and things like that. But it also results in kind of people expressing themselves without kind of immediate judgment and consequences. And when individuals are targeted to have their information exposed, it kind of comes around for three key areas. And the first one is financial gain and extortion. So in my case, it was to obtain a user account with a username, but really the underlying messaging there is financial gain. But it's also used to exert coercive control on someone. So we've seen circumstances where following relationship breakdown, someone might target their partner and expose their information online or sensitive images, etc., to kind of exert control over them, but also to influence someone. If you have damaging information on someone or anything that they wouldn't want exposed, and you could share that and publish it and link it to their online identity, it can be a way to exert that coercive control. But it's also been used to delegitimize and kind of damage individuals' characters and reputation in online communities, and kind of becomes this fight against multiple users and hackers as well. And that's to the second point of your question, who kind of gets targeted? And the answer is anyone. In the original days, when doxing kind of first appeared in the early 2000s, it was primarily used to target political figures and celebrities and had political motivations. But these days, it really is anyone. We've seen examples where minors who are playing online video games like Roblox, Minecraft, Fortnite can simply be targeted by an aggressive opponent that wants to beat them in the game and expose them and use that as a way to gain a competitive advantage, as crazy as that sounds. But there's also as old as the people as the elderly who might have recently started investing part of their retirement fund into cryptocurrency and are being targeted for financial extortion to obtain that cryptocurrency. There's also examples where general day employees that have corporate access to a large company, like a technology company, can be targeted and extorted to provide their credentials or corporate access to that organization to then propagate things like ransomware and data theft and extortion. So a lot of people think, oh, I have to have something for someone to target me, but you could have information, you could have access. It's not just money. And it could also be simply because someone doesn't like you and they want to delegitimize you and damage your credibility and your character.
Hmm. And when you look at some of these doxes that are published online, it's really extensive. And oftentimes they'll have like family members, they'll have usernames for all the usual services, education history, really quite pinpointed to a level where you're like, oh, it does give you kind of the creeps. And, recently there's been a way for people who are doing doxes to get a lot of data really quickly. Can we get into the emergency data request and how that scheme works?
Yeah, for sure. So when a perpetrator tries to dox someone, they use a variety of different sources to obtain information. Because the end goal is to reveal as much information as possible on someone, not just the usernames of their online accounts, but also personal information, like you said, email address, mobile, residential address, date of birth, who their employer is, where they went to school or education, university, even things like their health, their body weight, their height, medical history, um, credit cards, driver's licenses, IDs, and family members' names as well. And the techniques they use is a combination of open source intelligence, so OSINT, and closed source intelligence, CSINT. And OSINT kind of relies on leveraging public sources for data, but eventually data requests are something that would be considered a closed source intelligence technique. And CSINT is really for investigators and law enforcement that have access to legitimate data sources when investigating criminals and things like that. And so, in that kind of context, an EDR or an emergency data request is a procedure which is actually used by law enforcement for obtaining information from service providers and social media companies in emergency situations where there's really not enough time to get a subpoena. So, the kind of emergency situations that we would think about are things like an immediate threat to public safety, like a terrorist threat, where government workers or law enforcement log into these law enforcement panels that social media companies provide, and then submit a data request. So they'll provide a single data point, like an email or username, and request that the platform provide, the full name associated with the account, the email address, residential address, payment card history, and also message history, IP address, all these kind of further data points to pivot from. And so what happens is actually doxing perpetrators have realized that this is the fastest way to obtain highly accurate and sensitive data on someone, and they've weaponized it and used that process fraudulently. So ultimately, threat actors are stealing and compromising government email addresses, which might sound like a difficult task, but actually are for sale online for as low as $50 US, and then take those accounts, log in and verify themselves on these government panels, which are for law enforcement, and then submit a fraudulent emergency data request. So they'll actually send a request on a victim that they're targeting, that they want to unearth information on, and say there's immediate threat to public safety and send this fraudulent request. And then the social media company complies and provides the perpetrator all of this sensitive information on that victim. And then the perpetrator will leverage that to then carry out further attacks and subsequently extortion.
And this is because the EDR request, at least at one point, only required a government email address to do it. Like there was no phone call necessarily to an entity out of band to verify that this person is indeed the person that they're presenting themselves in the portal. They do have legitimate legal authority to request this type of information.
Yes, exactly. So it is definitely it's improving in terms of how these requests are handled and validated, just by nature because of the sensitivity of the information that can be exposed. Um, there are segregations of duties that have been implemented. Just because an email address has a .gov.au or .gov for US TLD, doesn't actually mean that that individual in that government agency should be making a request. And so they've kind of been working towards having allow lists of certain departments, agencies, offices that should be making these requests, as well as having segregation of duties so that if a request is raised, an additional government worker must sign off on that request. But some of these platforms are also shifting to using intermediary services, companies that specialize in maintaining relationships with law enforcement and with the private sector to facilitate those requests, because it is a significant burden on the social media companies to actually validate these requests. They get thousands of requests per day. And so
Yeah.
relying on those platforms can help assist with that. That being said, in certain circumstances, those actual intermediary platforms, which are supposed to add the validity of the request, also get compromised, and threat actors then also use those to send fraudulent requests. So it's an area where the industry is still kind of growing and evolving and figuring out how to make sure these requests are handled appropriately.
Yeah, it's tough because you don't want to increase the amount of time that it takes, to respond to a legitimate request then, right? That could cause, harm to people.
Exactly. And, we're talking situations where there is a genuine emergency data request required, an immediate threat to public safety. It could be a terrorist threat, hundreds of lives at risk, where, minutes, hours really make a significant difference in getting data to arrest someone. And so, in a way as well, social media companies and other service providers have this delicate balancing act of, if they push back and try to get more information to validate the request, there could be a serious consequence to public safety. And so it's a very, very careful balancing act that must be done.
Yeah, yeah. So, these doxes are published on the internet. I've seen them on things like Pastebin, but there's one site that has really emerged in the last few years that's just sort of like this sort of central repository for an enormous amount of personal data that's been scraped up on, people who are victimized by this, and it's called Doxbin. Can you tell us what is Doxbin and what's the business model behind it and how does it work?
Yeah, so Doxbin is a doxing website which effectively offers adversaries or doxing perpetrators a location where they can upload a victim's docs without it being taken down. And they first emerged in 2018, and they're still ongoing till today. So been in operation for about 7 years, which in the kind of underground scene is actually a long time to go without disruption. And to put into perspective the kind of size of this site, they actually have over 300,000 users and more than 165,000 published doxes of personal information. So the magnitude is very high in terms of, this isn't one small underground community. This is a large platform used by a significant amount of perpetrators. And the kind of business model behind Doxbin is that they have different user types where, depending on a cryptocurrency donation, can unlock additional features. And one of those features is the ability to actually publish private doxes. And so typically in the extortion process, when a victim is targeted by a doxing perpetrator, there's the threat of their information being revealed. It can either be posted immediately to Doxbin, and then that link is shared to the victim and saying, hey, I've already posted it public, now follow my extortion demand. Or there can be the threat of it becoming public. And so what happens is that the perpetrators upgrade their account, pay a donation to the website, and get this ability to publish a private docs or a password protected docs. So they upload all the information on their target to the site, get a unique one-time link, and then share that along with an extortion message to their victim. And so what happens is the victim sees that it's private, sees it hasn't been posted yet, and then they're more incentivized to actually pay and meet that extortion demand to prevent it being leaked and going public. Because on the Doxbin community, there's the ability to actually reply and add comments to published doxes. And so often a lot of community members will actually further antagonize victims and comment on their Doxbin post saying what they're going to do to them and things like that. So that's kind of the business model. But recently, we actually found out in earlier this year when the Doxbin site had one of the administrator accounts compromised by a rival hacking group called Tutor SH. And they actually revealed that the admins also ran a deny list on the back end of the website. And what this was basically is where people that had been victims that had been targeted ongoing could pay the website staff directly to have their personal information added to a deny list where anytime a Doxbin paste was posted that contained certain keywords, like a name or an address or an email address, etc., it would automatically delete the post. And so what this meant is that certain people that could afford this protection would make significant payments to the Doxbin administrators to basically prevent any information being posted by any actor. Whereas typically an extortion, yeah, so typically an extortion would be an individual targeting someone, and then you pay that perpetrator. But this is the actual intermediary platform offering a service to prevent any perpetrator from targeting them.
It's protection money. You've got to pay either way.
Exactly. And looking at the logs of who has actually paid, it also includes not just everyday individuals, but celebrities. So a good example was Mr. Beast, who's a very well-known YouTuber. He had his management team actually, well, I can't validate or confirm if they paid or how much they paid, but typically it's suspected that a payment is required in order to have your name deny listed on this back-end platform. And in this case, Mr. Beast, his team, they all had their names and their residential addresses deny listed on the back end of the Doxing website.
And I think this is probably a good point to transition into why is this site it's kind of barely within the legal bounds, but at least for the purposes of the United States, let's talk about the law. Why can't police take this down?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there's definitely legal loopholes, which I can explain, but ultimately there's an element of grey hat offshore hosting providers that are used where that are without the reach of not in the reach of law enforcement to try and disrupt. Will require further effort from law enforcement to focus on disrupting. But in terms of the legal loopholes, there is actually some US law regarding immunity to social media platforms and other websites. So it's called Section 230 of the US Communications Decency Act. And it basically provides an immunity to any website which republishes other users' content. So if you sign up and you post data on someone or anything, it could be on X, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or any other platform. If you post information on someone else, even if that's harassing or intended to intimidate them, the platform themselves cannot be held legally liable. And so because of
But
this,
they would have to take it down though, right? Within I know that's always kind of a squishy area, but they would be required to take it down, wouldn't they though? Or
well, it depends. It depends
hmm.
on the because that's actually a good transition to other law that applies in this case. And there's really two types of law or statutes that exist in the US, which is anti-stalking statutes and communication statutes around how you're allowed to communicate. And the, ultimately, fundamentally, all this law requires threats to be written directly in the communication that's sent to substantiate that someone could have felt substantial distress from receiving that threat. Now, Doxbin, kind of being aware of that, has actually mandated that none of the pastes or the doxes on the website can include direct threats. And so, what Doxbin is kind of positioning themselves is just a platform where people can post things or information. As long as that information doesn't contain a threat, they're happy with it. But they are very much know well and truly that the whole intent of their platform is to intimidate and harass people, and that a message of a threat will be sent either with the link to the docs or it's just by default implied by
Yes.
someone maliciously sharing information. And so, in terms of how things can be disrupted to make things better, there needs to be more definitions for what doxing actually is in a lot of law, and understand that with it, you can still feel a victim can still feel substantial distress without then being a direct written threat in the communication.
Absolutely.
Um,
It's intimidating behavior to publish somebody's personal information, right?
exactly.
On a site that's clearly intended, you know. for harm.
100%. And there needs to be language around malicious dissemination. And that's really the sharing of personal information without that person's consent. And if information is shared without consent, I believe it should be kind of reasonably defined in law that that has the intent of causing distress and therefore is punishable under and kind of can be, investigated under these stalking and communication laws.
Yeah, it's
Um,
tricky because some of it's open information, right? Though, too, some of it might be public. So it's kind of like, would that still, I guess if you still have the intention aspect of it too, in combination with the nature of sites such as this, that the overwhelming drive is for a negative impact on these people, right? And actually, that leads me to another question. Like, most of these are extortion attempts, right? Too, right? Which is clearly illegal, right? They're publishing information because they want something from that victim. Or what percentage would you say are extortion attempts versus I'm just going to do this just to bother you?
yeah, it's hard to say a percentage. I think coming back to the original objectives of doxing, it really can be a combination of factors. It can simply just be to apply coercive control on a victim. And that's not just to provide information, but to kind of have them live in fear. And maybe they reduce their activity online or make them change in some way um, to a desired intent. And so, and delegitimize them. I think in terms of the types of doxes that are posted on Doxbin, some have a lot of detail and some have little detail. So in the cases where there's just a few sentences about where someone lives and their name, that might be purely just to delegitimize and or to send a message as, hey, I'm looking into you. But when you've got document pastes that are hundreds of lines long, and it could literally be 15-page documents about someone's personal information, um, I think the intent is a lot more in line to extortion. Um,
Yes.
yeah, so it's it's hard to make an assessment overall, but ultimately the intent is to extort.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, I guess, if you could show that connection, if the victim could show that connection, right, um, and report it to police, then you think conceivably. But I guess also it's like what kind of data does Doxbin hold on the back end, right? How do you know who is doing this to you, right? And how do you find out their identities? Is that another complication in kind of doing like the full circle of this of like, I'm being extorted. I don't really know who this is, but I want to report it.
Yeah, so that's the thing is ultimately these perpetrators are unmasking targeted individuals and victims' identities, whilst also hiding behind the anonymity of their own online usernames performing these attacks. And so it is difficult. And platforms like Doxbin, they say that they do not hold logs on their users in terms of the accounts, like the IP address, things like that. So Doxbin actually maintains this kind of transparency report where they list all government agency requests that they've received to either take down information or to hand over user data, and they provide the kind of outcome. So they'll name the day of the request, they'll name the agency, the region, even the city, and what type of information was requested and what the outcome was. And in all circumstances that a request for user data has been asked for, they've not provided it, stating they don't hold that data. Um, so they're not complying in that sense. But at the same time, they have taken doxes down. And the reason for this is they're kind of balancing that delicate act of trying to appear as legitimate and maintain government relationships, whilst it's kind of accepted by the community that the whole intent of the platform is to propagate crime.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is they'll take that information if there's like a child under the age of 15 information posted, because that breaks their own terms of service for what can be uploaded. But realistically, I think they recognize that if they're caught distributing, child sexual abuse material or include content that could be explicit of minors, it's probably more likely to lead to their downfall than
Yeah. Very
in a
quickly.
more exponential and significantly faster way. And whilst offshore hosting providers can be used to host all these malicious sites, there is a kind of worldwide acceptance of, these providers still not necessarily hosting that type of material.
Yeah.
So it's just a means to an end for them, I think, in terms of staying online than a genuine care.
Yeah. And you've, as part of your research, you interviewed some of these people who were affiliated with Doxbin. I want to ask you, like, what are some of the things you discovered? And I also wanted to ask you about what's your sense of how are these actors that are heavily involved in Doxbin, how do they fit into like the larger sphere of this group that we call the COM, which is kind of like the English-speaking young threat actors in the US, the UK, here in Australia as well, that are known for their, very aggressive social engineering, known for cryptocurrency thefts, known for, now violence in the real world, where they're taking, beefs that were online and kind of paying people off to throw bricks through people's windows and things like that.
Yeah, so there's definitely a nexus between Doxbin and the COM. So the COM, it stands for the community, but it's really like a self-identifying subculture. It's a lot more complex than like a threat group where there's clear delineations of who is involved in it or a member. So using words like membership of the com, etc., we don't normally say that. And the reason is this com is more of this subculture and kind of social phenomenon where there are actually many groups within the com, and it's a very large, complex, sprawling network with potentially thousands of members and many different groups. And it's comprised mostly of teenagers and young adults in English-speaking countries, like you said, that commit crime, not just for financial gain, but also for fame and notoriety, as crazy as that sounds. And so the crimes are quite vast, like social engineering, crypto theft, SIM swapping, extortion, coming back to Doxbin, sextortion, swatting, kidnapping, and violence as a service like brickings, as you described, but also distributing and producing child sexual abuse material. And Doxbin is ultimately a platform that is used by com actors to post doxes of their targets. And so that's kind of how the nexus relates to them. Doxbin is a platform or almost a product or a solution that com actors use to assist perpetrating their crimes. And ultimately, the staff that run the Doxbin website are also associated with the com and that subculture, naturally just through their intermixing and intertwining of narratives.
I think that, or what do you think measures are going to impact doxing? Like, how can, if because it's kind of sitting in this sort of weird legal space, changing laws would be one thing, I guess, is particularly for the U.S. I know that you mentioned that in your presentation at Black Hat that the state of Arizona had specifically mentioned doxing in a law that they had passed. Do you think it's kind of like legal measures then that could dissuade threat actors from setting up these kinds of sites, or is there always just going to is this the kind of cyber criminal service that there's always going to be demand for because it's a really powerful way to intimidate and harass?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think law is not changing. Law isn't necessarily going to disincentivize criminals from conducting these acts. They'll do whatever they want to do, as they always have done. It's more about giving law enforcement more power to actually investigate these crimes and set precedents through arrests, which will then subsequently deter the criminals. So by having doxing not really be defined and being really loose in law and it being difficult to kind of investigate, what law enforcement are doing today to actually try and take down these criminals is focusing on the ultimate impact caused by the doxing in terms of the crime. So instead of focusing on this information is being posted, it's more around the actual the final impact caused by the actions. So like the sadistic extortion or the financial fraud or the computer intrusions and the financial theft. But one of the kind of key shifts that has allowed law enforcement to really target comm actors and Doxbin in a lot more detail is by classifying these groups that use these subgroups of the comm that use Doxbin as being domestic terrorists. So a really good example of that is this year, the Department of Justice actually classified 764, which is a kind of neo-Nazi right-wing sadistic extortion group, as being a terrorist organization and a tier one terrorist group, which has allowed the law enforcement to have a lot more power and resources with actually investigating and arresting and setting precedents of these actors. And I think once these actors in these groups realize that they're not untouchable and that they are of interest to law enforcement, that they'll realize and feel the full weight of the entire judicial system against them and put them away for a long time. Because we're seeing circumstances where, for example, the original founder of the 764 Statistic Group was a 17-year-old in Springville, Texas, was actually sentenced to 80 years in prison. So that's a minor 80 years in prison, 80. I mean, there's not really many cases where you can think of something like that happening, but it just puts into perspective the precedents they're trying to set with these types of crimes.
Yeah, yeah. And 764 is like that's even, you have the financial crime, of sort of comm actors of cryptocurrency theft, but 764 goes down a road of child exploitation and just some really horrific types of manipulation and grooming and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think whilst it can be easy to say, that's a group that's over here, ultimately they're all still using the Doxbin platform as a solution to help propagate those types of crimes and child abuse. So there might not necessarily be that information or those types of threats included on the Doxbin website, but it 100% is a vehicle which is leveraged and used by those types of actors.
And let's talk about defenses against doxing because I personally feel like being really close in this field of computer security and really aware of my OSINT footprint, I still feel that there's a whole lot of gaps that potentially if someone wanted to figure out your address, just through public records, through voting records, real estate records, things that are always going to be open, that there's that window there. I know particularly like in the US, there's some states that will give special protections to like police officers and public officials to be able to, for instance, not publish their address with their voting record. But for most regular people, that's not available to them. And also just phone number, using a phone number that's not tied to your identity, here in Australia, that's virtually impossible. You can't buy legally a SIM card from a provider without giving your details. Now, whether you decide to give them false details, right, or go down that road, I mean, that's something you could potentially do. But there's just a lot of things that now are tied to the government does want to know who you are, right? Because for legitimate purposes. But that also conflicts with being targeted by people like this or protecting yourself from being targeted like this. What do you think? What do you recommend?
Yeah, so there's definitely the basics to cover, which is what um, you know the general average day person should do, which is having higher privacy settings on social media, using unique complex passwords, enabling MFA and all your accounts, all the typical cybersecurity advice that you'd hear. But a big one is actually limiting the information you share online, like being a lot more conscious of when you're sharing information, like on social media, if it's set to public and private, or even if you should be sharing it at all. I'm actually more of quite a private person. I don't like to post anything on any platform. But what individuals should also do is actually make a habit of searching for yourself. Go into Google, type your name, and actually see what comes up and see if you can do something about it. And when I say do something about it, there's options. There's options to try and get information unindexed from Google. So you can contact Google and say, hey, I don't want these URLs to be, available for when searching for my terms of my names, etc. And if you typically provide a little bit of evidence around being targeted, they'll just remove it straight away. That doesn't make it go away, but it can inhibit it and make it more difficult for people to either find information about you or for perpetrators to unearth information on you. But coming back to the original discussion around the techniques that these perpetrators use, a combination of open source intelligence and closed source intelligence, you can do a lot to try and limit the ability and the speed and the efficiency of the open source intelligence techniques by making all these changes that we share. But if the attacker is leveraging closed source intelligence techniques like fraudulent and mentioned data requests, it kind of doesn't matter how many unique passwords you have. They're going to be able to find information on you by impersonating law enforcement, etc. So in that sense, there is a limit of what you can actually do, and it's about focusing your effort on trying to prevent their end goal, which is either extorting you or compromising your accounts. And so to prevent them extorting you, there's kind of just some general advice that I would give to someone if they were kind of being threatened by doxing. And it's really just to not interact at all. So seize all communication, do not reply. And silence is actually the most effective way to reduce like a doxing perpetrator's power. Blocking them on all platforms, ultimately protecting your digital identity by honestly deactivating all your social media accounts, which will actually limit the perpetrator's ability to kind of track and then harass you further. Changing your mobile number is another one as well, which should impact and manage phone harassment. But it's really important to actually report these sort of offences to authorities. So in Australia, we have like the Australian E-Safety Commissioner, which is really good. They actually have, it's one of the first few government agencies I've seen has actually defined doxing and provided recommendations for victims of doxing on their site, which is really important. But in the US, you've got agencies like the Department of Homeland Security. But in terms of preventing yourself, helping yourself in other ways, if you haven't been targeted yet, talking to the SIM cards and the mobile phone numbers that you talked about. In Australia, because of the Australian Media Communications Media Authority, it is a requirement to have, when you create a virtual mobile number, or any mobile number, that it is linked to a real identity. And even if you create a virtual number, it has a backup of a real number in the event that there is an emergency, they can contact you. So it is difficult to obtain like a mobile number that's not associated to you. And the reason that you would want to seek something like that, and what I covered in my Black Hat presentation, is that once a doxing perpetrator unearths your email address and your mobile number, they will try to compromise your email account. And the most effective way of doing that is to do a SIM swap or a SIM port on your SIM card to transfer the victim's personal number to a SIM card they control so they can receive the text messages. And what this allows them to do is go onto the social media account or onto Google or Hotmail, etc., click forgot password, receive that 6-digit code to the SIM card they control with your mobile number on it to then reset your password, delete your MFA, and log straight into your account. And once you have compromised someone's primary email account, you can then send further password resets to all of their accounts, cryptocurrency exchanges, etc., and compromise from there. And so, unfortunately, because of the difficulty of getting that separate virtual number in Australia, what I actually recommend is having a different number or a different MFA source other than SMS-based MFA for those accounts. So if we know that these are the tactics that actors use, instead of trying to prevent any actor from getting a mobile number, which is extremely difficult, and one day it will be leaked, the best thing is actually to mitigate the attack chain of knowing what they would do with it if they get that number. And that's compromising your account. So making sure that your accounts don't use SMS-based MFA, therefore not subject to that type of port forward or SIM swap attack. And even if they do SIM swap you and get access to your number, all they can really do is send a few messages to people, but won't actually be able to log in or reset passwords to any accounts. So using MFA like Authenticator, like Google Authenticator, or using a physical token like a YubiKey is like a preferred mechanism. But recently there is a big shift to using passkeys as well, which is another option as well. So it's really about acknowledging that SMS-based MFA is insecure by nature because of this reliance on telecommunications companies and SIM swapping and port forwarding, etc. And yeah, that's ultimately the recommendation, is to try and use MFA options that are not linked to SMS.
And service providers are a lot better these days too about providing the capability to do MFA in a separate app. too, that is not in the SMS channel. Whereas 10 years ago, it was everybody was sending the codes over SMS. So it wasn't, it's a different landscape now, isn't it? A little bit more. And I noticed like a lot of service providers won't necessarily allow you to reset your password just simply from a text message to a number. That was a big hole for a long time, but it seems like a lot just won't do that anymore, because they know that authentication is the primary way that accounts or ATO happens, account takeover happens.
Exactly. There's definitely a shift. Like a lot of banking institutions in Australia are now using like in-app code prompts for notifications to verify transactions. But they're also doing a lot more transactional based notifications. When I say transactional, I mean the sense of high risk actions performed by accounts. So if someone logs into your account and it's from a new sign in location, an email is sent to notify a user. And this kind of can empower like the user of the account to kind of do their own investigation and go, hang on a minute, that wasn't my sign in, and could delete a session, change password, things like that. Or changing a password, any kind of performing any kind of high risk activity or high risk transactional activity, and out of band notifications provided. There are obviously services where you can't put any other MFA option except for SMS. And that was when my presentation talked around trying to secure a virtual number. Unfortunately, in Australia, the only really way to do that is to use a service that forgets to identify you and you provide, a fake name. But that is also technically a grey area, and we wouldn't recommend. But you can, in other countries, you can still use like a US mobile number or another overseas number to have it as an SMA, as an MFA option for like an account of a system in Australia in certain circumstances. So you might be able to get a virtual number for the US and use that for an Australian account. But it really depends. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, Jacob, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Really good to have this conversation, Jeremy. Thank you.